It always happens. Never fail, I tend to forget. Actually, I'll record it in 2 places. Let's record through WebEx and we'll record in OBS. That way, if I forget to pause one, that's not a big deal. All right, so yes. So they will be recorded. They will be on YouTube. You are welcome to review them on YouTube as well if for whatever reason you're going to miss class. That being said, though, I do appreciate when people show up. I mean, I've never had, like, no students in a class. I think the worst case I've ever had is 9 students in a class. That's been pretty low. But for the most part, I've usually had, 12 to 20 on average. I know some of you guys have prior commitments like jobs and stuff, hence why we're doing this kind of hybrid asynchronous, synchronous kind of nature of teaching. So, if you have to miss class, that's fine. They will be recorded to YouTube. So not a huge deal. However, it does get me, to learn who you are and kind of establish a rapport with you the more you show up and the more you participate. Cool. So let's just talk a little bit about me, as selfish as that sounds. All right, so my name's Sean, and I've been teaching with Georgian College for about 5 years. Actually, it's over 5 years now. Yeah, it'd be over 5 years. So this is the first time, however, I've taught a Lakehead class. That's the only thing. Not that it makes a difference. It's literally the same class. It's just to a different set of students. That's all. So yeah, I went to Georgian College in 2012. I had worked a whole bunch of jobs before that and then had a really nasty accident. So I had to re-skill and figure out what I was going to do. I always kind of did programming as a hobby and really enjoyed it. So I decided, you know what, why not do it professionally? So I went to Georgian College. In 2012, I took the interactive web program, but at that time it was called Web Animation and Design. It used Flash quite heavily, which I mean was dead in 2012, and thank God is officially dead as of a month ago. So yeah, but whatever, it didn't matter. It was just really to get the piece of paper. I already knew how to program. And then from there, in 2017, I decided I was going to try to get my bachelor's degree. Yeah, no kidding. I was going to get my bachelor's degree. And I went to the University of Information Technology, the University of Ontario Information Technology, which is no longer called that because it was confusing. I can't remember what they changed it to. But I took game development and entrepreneurship, I think was the course. And turns out when you're nearly 40 and you try to do math and you only had completed grade 10 math, it's a big fail. So I got my grades that I got, and then I got out and decided to go back into the workforce. So that leads me to my experience. Like I said, I freelanced for quite a while in my youth, from 2005 to 2012, built a few cool sites and stuff. But after that, I decided to take it seriously, go to school, get an education, come back out, get some paperwork. And then I started with G-Shift, which is no longer, rest in peace G-Shift. But they were like a company that built search engine optimization platforms for marketers so that they could, manage search engine optimization. They got bought out by a company called Mintent. Fast forward a few years. I left them in 2015, went to Fireside Agency, which is a web dev shop, primarily works with WordPress, which I absolutely loathe. So when I was there, we built our own custom framework called Sparky, which is a model view controller system with a drag and drop front end. Did that, thought it was cool, decided I wanted to go to university, and then took off for a little bit and came back. When I came back, I did start back up with them for a little while, but then they decided to just go primarily with WordPress because they could pump them out at $1,000 a piece and they could do them in 4 hours, right? So they had no use for somebody who was more senior end with programming. So I left them, went to Mintent. Well, actually, I went to G-Shift, back to G-Shift, but they had turned into Mintent. And I've been there for 2 years and a bit. However, due to COVID, it kind of deep-sixed our company. They are a marketing platform company, and unfortunately, they lost quite a number of large clients, about almost, I want to say just over $2 million in lost revenue in a year. So we downsized about 15 people really quickly over a few months. And I got working notice. I'm one of the last ones around. I got working notice, so I decided I was going to go find something else. So as of not next week, but the following week, I start with LabX Media. I don't know if you guys know who they are. They're out of Midland, and they build many different platforms within the science community, whether it's e-commerce or it's publishing or stuff like that. But it's all science-based, so it's pretty cool. So I'm excited about that. My personality, I'm pretty relaxed and easygoing. A lot of people seem to like that because I listen. So if you have a problem, you can't get assignments in for whatever reason, or you're having a family emergency, I'm not ruthless about that. I do listen. I do have expectations, but I do listen, and I will work with you. So if you need help with anything, please let me know. And then how to communicate with me. We kind of went over this already. Slack is definitely the best way to communicate. Email should be your secondary, right, approach. I would definitely use Slack. It is an industry standard tool for the most part. Like, I use Slack at G-Shift. Going into LabX, they use Slack. When I worked at Fireside, we use Slack. I know Discord's probably the approved communication tool amongst most students. I know when I was at university, we used Discord. But Slack tends to be the more industry tool. So it kind of gives you the experience of using Slack as well. Cool. So we're going to talk about JavaScript frameworks. That's what this class is. So if you're in the wrong class, you should probably bail. This isn't Psych 2 or anything like that. It's just JavaScript. Hopefully you guys took a client-side JavaScript class. I know at Georgian, for some reason, it's optional and they don't have to take it, which definitely, when you come to this class, gets a little tricky when you don't previously have any JavaScript experience before this. But I mean, it's not impossible. It is a framework. It is really just a matter of learning the syntax. You guys already have the basics of, intro to programming, so it shouldn't be that bad anyways. So we're going to learn about frameworks in general. I imagine you guys have already used a few frameworks as you've been going through your course. We're going to take a look at what frameworks are, explain how they're boilerplate application structures, basically. They tend to be opinionated. We're going to look at different examples of frameworks. So some of the examples we're going to work with in this class will be Bootstrap. We won't be using HTML5 boilerplate or any MVC framework. Sorry, that's my dog. That's the wonderful thing about being remote. You're definitely going to hear Murray from time to time. He hates all people, sounds more ruthless than he is, but he's just a big, lovable golden retriever, so no worries there. The MVC frameworks that we're going to use in this class will be custom, basically, because we're going to be using Express, but we'll use the MVC pattern. It's fine if you don't know what MVC is. That's totally okay. Actually, have you guys taken an MVC course, like ASP.NET done an MVC or anything like that? Have you done MVC yet? Yeah, last semester? ASP.NET. Did you have it with Rich Freeman? Yeah, cool. Yeah, I like Rich. Yeah, so that's awesome. So you guys have had some experience with MVC, routing, models, views, controllers. That's cool. So we're going to build basically a custom one. We're going to build our own controller set, and we'll be using models. Our view will be slightly different, though. Instead of the view being delivered by the server, our view will be our React application. We're essentially going to build a client-side React application and an API backend using Node and Express. So you'll get that experience of working with two completely separated machines that are talking to each other, which is a good pattern to learn, especially considering most of the industry goes that way. So yeah, we're going to take a look at the Create React App framework. I know React App itself is a library, but Create React App as a framework as it scaffolds things for you. We're going to look at React Bootstrap. We are not going to look at React stylized components because it just tends to add more bloat to the course, and it's literally something you can pick up in a few minutes. And we're going to use Mongoose, which is a JavaScript object data modeler, or an ODM. I don't know if you guys use an ORM, or an object relational mapper, when you did your MVC course. Probably not. But yeah, we're going to use an ODM, which just makes working with data a little simpler. It actually allows us to be able to create associated and relational data using Mongo, which is a non-relational database. So it allows us to be able to do that. We're going to definitely dip our feet into many, many libraries, especially considering how easy it is to work with libraries in JavaScript. We're going to use Node, or NPM, sorry, as a package manager, as well as Yarn. So you'll get experience with both package managers. At the end of the day, you could really just use one. You don't need to use both. But we're going to touch both so that you guys have experience with both of them. We'll use Yarn with the React front end, as it is the preferred package manager for the front, and then we'll just use NPM for the back. I mean, again, it doesn't really matter, but that's what we're going to do. You guys have likely used package managers in the past, such as like wget or apt, or maybe even some of you, if you have a Mac, you might have used brew, though brew is now available for Linux as well if you happen to use Linux. Is anybody rocking a Linux machine? I ask this every semester, and usually it's a no. Anybody using Linux? I'm going to take that as a no. A dual boot? Cool. What's the second boot, Braden? Is it Mint, or you rocking something more old school like Red Hat or something? Pop OS. Yeah, I like Pop OS. It's nice and clean. I use Linux in my day job. A lot of companies are starting to head towards Linux just because buying Macs for every one of your web developers is so expensive. But they want that kind of relationship with the servers, right? Because most of the servers that are out there, most of your hosting solutions are Linux based, especially if it's AWS or DigitalOcean or something like that. So because of that, you kind of want that one-to-one relationship that Windows doesn't really provide without using something like Linux subsystems or something like that. So a lot of companies are heading towards Linux because they can build computers, and that's considerably cheaper than buying Macs, and then install Linux on them and use Linux. I am not an OS hater by any means. I don't hate Windows, I don't hate Mac, I don't hate Linux. I just use whatever operating system's put in front of me. I do have preferences though. I like the customizability of Linux. I'm able to do a lot more in Linux than I can in the other ones. That might just be my lack of understanding as well. Alright, so the common JavaScript libraries we're going to be using are obviously React. We're going to use Node, which isn't a library. I don't know why I wrote it down as a library. It's not a library. Well, it kind of is. Express, right? Express is a library that we're going to be utilizing. Moment.js we might not, and CKEditor we might not, but we will be using Bootstrap. We'll be using a whole bunch of other NPM things like Axios and Cores, and I'm forgetting, Passport. That's a big one. That's our authentication library. So we're going to be using quite a few libraries during our course. Cool. I'm actually on time for once. Usually I'm way off time. All right, so our examples. This is a practical class. Now, I know when I went to university, we usually had a 1-hour lecture, and then that hour lecture was like, we didn't do anything hands-on. We just did an hour lecture. Listen to some guy chat for an hour. And then when he was done, we had a tutorial class, which was out like a separated time, and we had to show up, and then we did some practical stuff where we were building a game engine at the time. This class, most times, will just be 3 hours of practical hands-on experience. So you should always be in your IDE pretty much when you show up to class, because we'll be doing stuff in your IDE right away. I just find that people tend to grasp more when they're doing, and they tend to understand better when they're doing than when they're just some random schmo is just talking about it. So the overview of the next 13 weeks. So this week, obviously introductions, learning a little bit about who I am, what my expectations are, and then plus a very small JavaScript review. So the JavaScript review will just be covering some of the syntax. Maybe some of it will be new for you because we are going to touch on things like destructuring and the spread operator and arrow functions, which you guys might already know, but we will touch on those just in case you don't. Then there's a JavaScript review quiz. So I'm going to try to cover as much as I possibly can on the JavaScript review, but we likely won't complete it all during this class. There's like 5 hours worth of review stuff there. So if we don't wind up covering it all during this class, it is expected for you to just go over it, make sure you understand it, and then there's a quiz. You have 2 attempts to do the quiz. I mean, you don't necessarily need to do the review to do the quiz. If you already know JavaScript well enough, you'd probably be successful anyways. There's 11 questions. It's not very hard. But yeah, there is a quiz that's due by the following week. Next week, we're going to be looking at React. So we'll be right into React. We're going to take a look at the Yarn package manager. We're going to understand the difference of building a React in development versus production, where we flatten it and build it out. We're going to talk a little bit about JSX, which is the templating language used by React. We're going to talk about React Bootstrap. I mean, very little bit about React Bootstrap, but we will talk a little bit about React Bootstrap. I'm by no means a designer. Maybe some of you are decent designers, but I definitely am not. So when I do any prototypal software that I'm building, I use Bootstrap. That way designers don't want to kill me. And it looks nicely organized, but I can't take credit. That's Bootstrap. Yeah, so we're going to implement that, and then we're going to look at deploying to Netlify. So you guys will learn right off the bat how to deploy your code to Netlify. This all will require you to understand Git and GitHub, which I'm hoping you guys already know by this point. You guys are in what, your 4th semester probably? I don't know what semester you're in. Do you guys know GitHub? Does anybody not know GitHub? Or never touched GitHub? Or Git? No, we're good? Alright, I'm going to take your silence as we're good. If not, I will post a video that I have that walks through how to set up GitHub and set up Git on your local machine and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I imagine most people would have used Git in a previous class. I would hope so. It is the industry standard, right? You're not going to be able to get away from it. Everybody uses Git. I mean, it's so funny when I hear, like, for example, I teach PHP as well. Don't make fun of me. But I teach PHP as well. And in that class, the school sets up AWS for the students. It's just a simple EC2 with MySQL on it, and they basically VPN in and then access the box. But then they use FTP. I haven't touched FTP in I don't know how many years because it's not what I do. But so it's interesting that we're using FTP instead of a deployment solution. But in this class, we'll be using deployment solutions. So you'll be pushing to Git, and then Netlify has its own built-in deploy. So it will auto-deploy your code for you. It actually is a full CI/CD, so continuous integration, continuous deployment. It doesn't necessarily test your code, but it does review your code for any errors that there might be that you would have to resolve to deploy. But we'll be looking at that next week. And then Heroku, same thing, except for it doesn't do any actual testing, but it will do continuous deployment. Okay, cool. So the week 3, we'll be looking at components and component design. We'll be taking on atomic structure, which is, some people hate it, some people like it. It does make for a lot of extra files. However, it is nice in the fact that it maintains your code because it's a lot more modular, so it's easier to see what each of your pieces of code are doing, and then you can do more with your code. I really like atomic structure, and it definitely blends well with some of the testing tools out there like Storybook, because it prefers atomic structure. So we'll be learning atomic structure. We'll take a look at our first 2 hooks, props and state, just using them a little bit, just a little tiny bit. But yeah, so the next class after that, we'll be looking more in depth at what hooks are and React Router, which will allow us to be able to navigate around our React application. And then in the last week of React, we'll be looking at React and data. So we'll take a look at what structured data is, how we can build JSON structures, and then we'll take a look at React and APIs, and we'll connect to, I think that's the Marvel API. Yeah, we'll connect to a Marvel API and pull some superhero data. And that'll be it for React. Then you have a midterm on React. So that will cover that whole time period. There will be a project during that period as well, a React project. I think it comes in week 4. It gets issued in week 4, nothing huge. And then there's also a few labs in that time period as well. I think there's 1 lab actually during that time period. You can see that in the syllabus. Week 7 is when we'll start taking a look at Node and Express. We'll set up our tools, we'll create a server, and we'll learn a little bit about MVC, and we'll likely deploy to Heroku in that class as well. We'll take a look at understanding the Restful Api Architecture. So you're going to learn about REST in this class, representational state transfer, which is just fancy for building an API and using a router. We're going to look at Routing 101, which you will already have experience with, having learned about React Router in the other section. This will give you a little bit more involved on the server side on what we're doing with routing. Concept's the same though. We're going to build some controllers and models. The models will be using Mongoose to create those, and then we're going to create a very simple read-only API. And then week 9 and 10, we'll be taking a look at building CRUD using Node and Express, and build a full CRUD API that allows you to be able to connect to it. We'll probably connect using Hopscotch, or you can use Postman. It's totally up to you, but I will teach Hopscotch. Hopscotch will allow us to be able to make API requests to our server and create data, read data, update data, and delete data. So we'll likely learn to do that, which is a good experience to have because it teaches you how to use external tools for stuff like that. You can also curl it if you really want to go old school. And then we'll take a look at authentication in part 1 and part 2. So authentication, the reason why there's 2 parts is because in the first part, we're going to create a user model, and we're going to discuss what the user model looks like. We're going to We're going to implement Passport Local, which will provide the authentication side to our user's model. But because our application is running on a server and we'll be connecting to it from a client, we won't have any sessions that we can technically tap into. So we need some sort of way to be able to continuously authenticate ourselves anytime we make a new request to our API. So the first time we authenticate, we will authenticate using Passport Local, which will give us back a token, and then the second time we authenticate, which will be Authentication Part 2, we'll be using JWT, which stands for JSON Web Tokens, and we'll be providing it a web token each time we want to make an authenticated action. And then after that, it's the final, which is date to be determined. So in Georgian, we get a week, and it's just the regular class, and everybody just does the test at the regular time. However, I guess with Lakehead, they schedule an exam. So that exam and the midterm will both be online, either way. They'll both be 3 hours. They're both open book, and they're both open internet, and they're both open chat programs, because the way it's set up is it's a challenge that is individualized per student. You're given that challenge and you solve that challenge. The idea is that if you're out in the industry and you were given a challenge to do well at work, you would still have your colleagues to work with, right? So you'd still be able to ask questions. A lot of people go into that thinking it's going to be super simple, and I've got my buddy, he knows everything, I'll be able to rely on him to help me. And I'm telling you right now, I've had a number of students fail these tests with that being their expectation. I do recommend studying. I do recommend coming in with knowledge, not just trying to wing it. Because it is trickier than it sounds. Yeah, so any questions about any of that stuff so far? Google is my best friend. It's my best friend too, actually. Google is my best friend. No? No questions? Stack Overflow is also my best friend, Riley. I mean, I go to Google, but it always sends me to Stack Overflow. Yeah. All right, the gradables. Let's talk quickly about the gradables. We will have 2 quizzes in this class. I used to do 5 quizzes, and then I realized how much I don't like marking, so now we have 2 quizzes. 2 quizzes, 3 labs in total. All of those are worth 7%. I mean, it's the easiest 35% you'll ever get. The labs are small. They're meant to be done half hour, like easily within a half hour. The quizzes will never exceed 20 questions. In fact, most times they'll never exceed 10 questions. So they're very light and easy, and I love quizzes because they just mark themselves. Labs are a little bit trickier because obviously I have to mark them. But by the time you get your first lab, you'll be deploying online. So the way I mark labs online is I go to your website, I mark your lab, and the first time I get some sort of error is when I open your code. So if I get no errors, I'm happy, you're happy, you get full marks, and we move on. I do give bonuses. If you know anybody who's ever taken a class with me before, they'll tell you they're a bit excessive. It's not odd to have a student end with 110% in my class. I love people who think outside the box, right? So when you implement things that I haven't taught and you just embed them in your labs, I mean, I get giddy about that. I love that kind of thing because it shows me that you enjoy programming, you like programming, and you like to use it to solve problems, right? So I look for that, and it also stands out in my head as when somebody's like, hey, Sean, do you know anybody who's looking for work? It's like, oh yeah, I know this person, and they're able to do this, so for sure. I've had 1, 2, 3, 4, I want to say at least 15 to 20 students hired at different companies I know over the last 3 years. Just because of them standing out and me knowing who they are and how they're capable of doing it. I won't recommend people who can't do the job, but I definitely recommend people for the job if they're capable of doing it. I also will recommend jobs to you if I know who you are and I find a job that seems to fit your skill set. React project. So that'll be the first project. Don't get paranoid. It is 20%. It is a hefty mark. It isn't difficult, right? So it won't use any APIs unless I provide the data to you, but it will be open-ended in the fact that you can build really whatever you want. So I give you an outline of what I'm looking for, but this gives you the chance to really add something personable to your portfolio. I used to do them pretty rigid, and you had to build like a reservation site, or you had to build a I don't know, a grading system or something like that. And then I stopped because too many students wanted something unique in their portfolios to be able to provide to their employers. So this is open-ended. You guys just build whatever you want, providing you meet the expectations. Same with the API project, no different, same idea. You just build whatever you want. As long as it's an API, I'm happy. If you want to connect the API to the React project at some point, go for it. I'm totally open to that as well. If you want to build some monolithic project, go nuts. And then the midterm exam, which is worth 10%, not a ton of marks, but significant enough. And then the final exam, which is worth 15%. Arguably, the Node half of this course is more difficult than the React side. The React side's pretty simple. The Node side gets a little bit trickier because there's a lot. MVC is an interesting design pattern, so there's a lot of things in different places, and we're basically building an MVC system from scratch. So you'll get that experience, which is good because you'll definitely likely encounter MVC out in the workforce. All right, we have 10 minutes before we take our first break. Okay, expectations, communication, already talked about that. How do I want you to communicate with me? What do I want you to use? Preferably. Yes, Slack. Thank you. I want you to use Slack, if you can, please. Oh, definitely this. This is a big no-no. Here, I'll even zoom in a little bit for you. We'll make... Oh, go in senior size on the wrong side. Senior size. There we go. Do not ask questions via the YouTube comments section. I tend to miss them, right? And I've had students in the past say, hey, Sean, you said this, but I can't find such. Don't. Just email me or Slack me, preferably Slack. That way it gets responded to. You know, if you found it in YouTube, please let me know because I can just go update the YouTube thing as well. But yeah, I definitely don't leave questions in there because they'll likely never get answered and I don't want to offend anybody. Handing in assignments, due dates and penalties. Labs are due by midnight before the section's class. Same with quizzes. They're due around the same time. I expect them to be done before the next class. Those will all be explicitly defined when you go to the quiz or the lab. The due date is there. Make sure you always review the due date. These notes are always provided, but they're not always updated. So that being said, because they're not always updated, don't rely on all the information you read in the notes. Definitely watch the YouTube videos. Definitely look at the due dates and stuff so that way they're accurate. Okay. You get 2 attempts per quiz. That being said, there's 2 attempts mostly because I don't know whether Lakehead's shell is anywhere as bad as Blackboard is, but Blackboard's pretty terrible, and we have to give 2 because often what will happen is the browser will crap out or Blackboard will crap out, and then you wind up losing one of your submissions. So this way, at least you're guaranteed 2 submissions to get it right. Quizzes are due before the next class. Talked about that. Projects are steep penalties. That's wrong. It's actually 10%. Same with labs. Every day they're late, it's a 10% deduction. Unless you contact me. If you contact me and tell me why it's going to be late, and if I say, hey, throw me your GitHub link so I can see what you've done so far, and you have code on there, likely there will be no late penalty whatsoever. Okay? If you don't have a GitHub link and you haven't started and you're telling me it's late, it's late. It's just late. Cool. This non-working code subject to an immediate 20% deduction, I will remove that. That was my, I don't know, dictatorship personality coming through at that point. I don't do that. I don't penalize like that. All right, cool. How to hand in labs and projects. Push to GitHub at all times, please. If you don't provide me a GitHub link and you zip it and put it onto the shell, you will receive a 20% deduction. I am really enforcing Git and GitHub because, like I said, there isn't a single job out there that I can think of, well, unless you find some real mom and pop shop, that you're not going to be required to know Git and GitHub. So definitely need that experience. If I require you to deploy to a live link, again, same 20% deduction. I expect the live link to be there. Not just live, but also working. So don't upload zip files. Don't provide me a cloud storage link like Dropbox or OneDrive, Boxy, Google Drive, or any of those type of things. Yeah, you know what? I'm not surprised by that, Jillian, because the Simcoe County District Board takes a little bit to catch up to the rest of the world. Like, it's a slow rollout. Like, arguably, I worked at Best Buy a long time ago. We were using IE6. when it was like, I don't know, 2010, and we were using IE6 on all of our terminals because it was like a few $1 million to roll out an upgrade. It's the same thing with the school board, right? It just costs so much to do the rollouts. Oh, did you work at Best Buy as well, Kyle? Yeah, Best Buy systems were a nightmare for sure. Yeah. Yeah, so no cloud storage links as well. Oh, that opens up another thing too. A lot of people like to use cloud storage to back up their stuff as they're working, right? And that's totally fine. I'm all for that. If you want to back up your code, definitely worthwhile. But if it's active code that you're working with, like if it's code that we're working with in class and you're running it and stuff, don't use Dropbox. Especially if you're on Windows, don't use Dropbox or anything like OneDrive or anything like that. What I have noticed in the past, you're wind up with file system issues because what happens is OneDrive buries itself in your file system. You're putting node modules in, and node modules can be like 10 levels deep, and you actually exceed the file naming restriction in Windows. And because of that, Windows won't let your application run properly. So don't bury it into cloud systems. Just put it in a normal drive, work with it, and then when you're done class, copy it over to your cloud system after that. I actually shut my cloud system off entirely when I'm teaching class because it tends to screw things up. Don't copy and paste your code into submission fields. Might seem obvious, but I've had it happen several times. And obviously, not Blackboard, the shell that you're working with. Do not upload each and every individual file to the Lakehead shell, right? And this is true still. They're very reduced in size. They are meant to be, labs are meant to be completed within an hour, and projects are usually meant to be completed within a day or two. So they're not massive things. Don't leave them to the last minute though, right? Misconduct, I don't think it's going to be an issue. It wasn't an issue last semester or the issue before the semester. I tend to give things that don't really lend to misconduct, but I guess it's potential it could happen. Obviously, identifying you've committed misconduct is you're using somebody else's work, right? I mean, it boils down to that. You've copied and pasted some other person's work, and you submitted it as your own. That's pretty much it. Whether or not it comes from the internet, comes from lynda.com, Coursera, or any of those course things, even doing a tutorial online and submitting it as your own work is considered misconduct. So don't do that. Make it your own. It's fine to look at tutorials and work on tutorials and do those things, but don't submit them as labs or projects. Okay? How I identify you've potentially cheated. Your mistakes are usually the same as someone else's mistakes. It's so funny. We want to believe our code is impervious to mistakes, but the sad fact is they are not. And when a mistake presents itself, it tends to stand out like it's wearing a rainbow uniform to me. And then I quickly find another one that's the same thing. Oh, I appear to have Toby looking for a mission again. There you go, Toby. All right. Variable names tend to be identical to other people's. Your code alignment, tabs, spaces, nesting. Junior developers tend to not tab very beautifully like they should. So that usually stands out and it's obvious. Complex algorithms. I've seen that before. All of a sudden, I'm sitting here looking at your code and it's pretty simple and pretty junior, and then all of a sudden I see a complex algorithm out of nowhere. That usually is a red flag, so I'll go look it up. Or your code seems more sophisticated than your previous submissions, right? You failed lab 1, lab 2, lab 3, but all of a sudden on the project, it's knocked out of the park. So I tend to go check on it and just make sure everything's okay. So if any of the above is true, I generally run your code through testing suites that I've built over time that just check it to see how it compares to other people's codes, compares it to Google to see if it's findable on Google, and then if I find it, then we have a conversation, you receive 0. So if you do happen to commit misconduct, I tend to just zero it out. So it gets a 0, and we have a conversation. I've never had anybody commit misconduct more than once, because usually that 0 is pretty nasty. But yeah, if it becomes an issue where it is more frequent, then I will contact the registrar's office and submit your name to the registrar's office and go that route as well, which would suck, right? You don't want that to happen. It can definitely affect you getting OSAP and things like that. And why do I care? I mean, like I said before, I work in the industry, and the last thing I want is the industry filled by people who can't do the job, and then it pisses off employers who now don't want to pay people because they've got burnt so many times. You know, they hire this guy at 80K or 70K, and turns out he can't do very much at all. Just copies and pastes code and it doesn't work and that kind of thing. And then the next person he hires is going to get paid less because he doesn't want to get burnt every single time during training and things. So I care, I care that you guys aren't cheapening the industry. And it reflects upon, it says Georgian, but it reflects upon Lakehead as a credible school as well, right? So if people are cheating, then it doesn't look good on Lakehead if most of the students they're getting from that school have committed misconduct. And it also demonstrates that you're dishonest, which makes it difficult to suggest you for jobs, especially at places that have vulnerable data like banks. Actually, arguably, any place with a secure backend has vulnerable data, right? So it makes it difficult to suggest people for those things. Any questions about any of that stuff? About any of the stuff we just went through? Nope. All right. Cool. There is a big GitHub section. We're going to take a 10-minute break, but there is a big GitHub section here. Talks a little bit about GitHub, the different aspects of GitHub. I'm not going to expect you to do any merging, branching, any of that type of stuff. We won't be doing checkouts. We won't be doing any diffs, but we will do init, status, add, push, pull, those kind of things. I don't know if you guys use Git GUI. Like if you're using a GUI for it, I tend to just do it right out of the command line. So if you don't have experience using the command line, you're going to get experience using the command line because that's generally the way I do it. So if you want to look over that, you can, or just take 10 minutes and go do whatever you want for 10 minutes. When we get back, we will start looking at the review. And then we'll get as far as we can, and then after that, it'll be on your own. All right? Okay, let's take 10 minutes. Pause button again so it unpauses. Let me know so we're guaranteed to have a recording for this class. The last thing in the world I want to have to do is re-record it on my day off. That would suck. Alright, so we are going to do some very basic JavaScript review, and we're going to kind of like pound through it pretty quick so that we get a good idea of what's going on. Just a couple of things before we get into that. If you don't have an IDE, though I don't know why you wouldn't, but if you don't have an IDE, please download an IDE. I personally use Visual Studio Code. I used to use Sublime. It was like my favorite. And then Visual Studio Code pretty much had everything Sublime had, so I was like, you know what, I'll make the change because it's free. I don't wind up with the nagging thing from Sublime. And I like it. It's not too bad. So I use VS Code, plus there's a bunch of extensions for VS Code. I mean, Sublime had extensions too, but there's a bunch of extensions for VS Code that make developing in React a little simpler, and as well as Node. So that's helpful as well. So I use VS Code. You can use whatever you want. The only thing I wouldn't recommend using is Visual Studio. It's just so ridiculously oversized for developing in JavaScript that it just feels like a sledgehammer when you really don't need that much, right? But yeah, you do you. GitHub, obviously we're going to be working with GitHub, so if you don't have an account, make sure you sign up. If you don't have Git installed on your computer, go to the git-scm.com and download Git, but likely all of you have it. And we're going to be working with Netlify, but we probably won't use Netlify till next week. Yes, WebStorm's a good one. Do you guys still get it for free? I know the school had like an agreement with JetBrains. Yeah, okay. That's pretty cool. Yeah, WebStorm's good. Plus when you guys take, I don't know if you guys get C++. I think there's like WebLion or something like that, or Lionstorm. I can't remember what the other one is, but there's like a C++ version of it as well. And there's like all the different JetBrains utilities, right? Like all their different IDEs. I don't mind JetBrains. I used it a long time ago for developing in Ruby, but then I stopped because it kept screwing up my Git. I don't know how, but it just kept destroying my Git. And I didn't bother to figure it out. Alright, cool. So if you want to go ahead and open up your IDE, let's talk about folder structures, because I imagine that's a good place to start with. I'm going to take this over here, and I already haven't actually pinned anything yet. I'm going to write it to my Dropbox folder, but my Dropbox right now is actually turned off. But I will be writing to my Dropbox folder. So I'm going to create, I have a Comp 2068 folder. You should probably have a Comp 2068 folder. Oh shoot, that's a zip file, dude. There we go. Let's try to do the one that's not a zip file. All right, so I'm going to create my live lessons folder. Doesn't matter what you call yours. It doesn't matter. All right, in here is where I'm going to put our weekly lessons. So this week will be lesson 1. Don't you love my naming? It's incredibly inventful. Lesson 1. That's some Oscar wild wordplay there. That's for sure. I have VS Code that I work with, so you can either, if you're using VS Code, you can go ahead and open it up or whatever your IDE is. But what's kind of nice is I can actually double click on this folder, right click inside the folder, and choose to open with code, which will just automatically open that folder in my IDE, ready to go. I reinstalled Windows recently. My wife for Christmas bought me a Oculus Rift S, and I kept trying to get it to work in Windows, and I couldn't get it to work because I had done some crap with the PSVR way back trying to get it to work on the PC, and I screwed up everything to do with virtual reality on my machine. So I just reset my Windows. So there's still some things missing, but hopefully that's okay. So this lesson 1 folder, we're just going to create a new file. Hold on, let me look at my source stuff here. There we go. I think we'll just call this round 1. That's what I'm going to call it. New file, round1.js is what I'm going to call it. And I'll zoom in so you guys can see. Can you see me? Can you guys see that okay, or do I need to go a little bigger? Awesome. All right, I'm going to dock it to the right and shrink down this bar a little bit. There we go. And I'm going to open up a new web browser window and put that over to the left. And I'm going to open up, we're going to create a new index file called index.html, like so. And if you're using VS Code, what's really cool is you can hit the exclamation mark like so. Emmet is automatically a part of VS Code, and you can either click the Emmet hint that comes up or hit tab, and it will autofill your HTML for you. Now, what I like to do is just, when it's short little snippets like this, I just copy them and I put them in the chat. We could use Pastebin, that's totally fine as well. I've used that in the past. But this seems to work just as well. So if you want to just copy and paste that into a file called index.html, that would be great. Just give me 1 second. Word wrap is turned off and it's annoying me. There. Oh, geez, and my tabbing is all off too. Why is everything so out of whack? There we go. That's better. I like to use only 2 tabs if I can. That looks okay too. Awesome. Okay, cool. So this is just going to be our JavaScript review. So we can give it a name if we want. Super simple. Just going to fix the tabbing that's in this file because it's driving me batty. And then I'm just going to link up this round 1 just so it loads. So I'm going to add a script tag here using a source, round1.js, and there we go. So nothing new. This should all seem fairly familiar. If you've had the intro to JavaScript course, this should all seem fairly basic. Now the reason why I left my File Explorer open is because I want to be able to open up this index file in here, and I could go to just Control O in here, like so, and go open it up this way, but I like drag and drop, so I'm just going to literally drag the index file, which currently has an edge icon on it, into Chrome, and it opens up this inside here. I know because the tab says JavaScript Review. Lesson code files will be posted to Git. Yeah. Wait, what's DTL? I've never seen that before. What's D2L? Oh, is that course link? Yeah, it'll be posted to Git, and then I'll load the GitHub link underneath the course content. Gotcha. Cool, I didn't know that. I learned something new. D2L. There we go. Doesn't stand for down to lick, right? No, that would be terrible. Don't lick things, especially in COVID era. Desire to learn. That makes way more sense, yeah, than down to lick. Yeah, definitely. More COVID friendly. Yeah. Desire to lick. Yes, that's true too. All right, so we have this, and obviously we're not going to see much in here. I'm not going to really put in things. I mean, we could go, let's create an H1, and we'll do, hey there. There we go. And obviously you're not going to see anything. Hit Control-R. Cool. But we can do something better, right? Like, I don't want to have to hit refresh every time we make a change. So why don't we take a look at something called Live Server. Live Server makes it easier for us to be able to just view our code as we're developing. Not something we're going to do in React, but it is something we're going to do today. So if you are using VS Code, if you're not, you're kind of on your own. You're going to have to figure it out. But if you're using VS Code, you can click on the extensions link here, and you just type in Live Server, which should be the option right up at the top. And then it says it's installed already, actually. If it is, I have no idea where the link is. But go ahead and click install if it's not installed for you. And then I bet you the reason why I don't see it is because I need to expand. Usually it's just down here. Maybe it's up here. It's somewhere. It has hidden itself. Are you Live Server? Nope. Nope, 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 nope. Nope. Interesting. It's disappeared. Well, let's try uninstalling it and then reinstalling it. And maybe the icon will show up. Usually it shows up down at the bottom. Alright, you know what? Not important. Not going to use Live Server today. Can't find it. Not important. I'll just refresh like a peasant. That's totally okay. Did it work for you? Yeah, I can't find the stupid icon. I'll figure it out later. It's not a big deal. Maybe that's why. No, it's not. Alright. So we have our round 1 JS connected to our scripts. We can see that. But what I want to use, right-click.html and open using Live Server. Oh, they hit it. Yes, I want to allow access. There we go. That's so much better. Thank you. Thank you very much. Cool. All right. So now as we save, right? So if I do hi there, everybody, and hit save, it auto-updates in the browser and we don't need to refresh it. Not so much cool with this. Definitely cool when you're doing things like CSS styling. Then it tends to be more important. The cool thing about React, though, is when we start developing in React, it just does this automatically for us. So we don't actually need to set up Live Server. But what I want to do is I want to be able to see things we do in JavaScript, and the easiest way to do that is by opening up the developer tools. Hopefully you guys are already familiar with the developer tools. If you're not, then this is a good way to learn. If you press F12 on your keyboard, the developer tools should load up on the right-hand side or wherever you currently have them docked. The tab we're going to start in is the console tab, because we're going to use that to output anything we need to the screen. In fact, we don't even really care what's happening over here. We only really care what's happening in the console tab. I'll even make it super big. Senior size, as I like to say. Kind of jumped ahead when I wrote this line, so we'll take it back and we'll talk a little bit about the first thing, which is commenting, right? Commenting, you guys have all done commenting in many languages. I imagine you've taken, what, probably 2 to 3 Java courses at this point. I know the school tends to like Java. Georgian loves Java. I wouldn't doubt Lakehead's into Java. Have you guys done any Java? Yeah, I thought so. The good news is that Java and JavaScript have some similarities to them. They both use dot syntax, obviously, but JavaScript isn't a strict language. It's a loosey-goosey duck-type language. But, some of the syntax is the same. And one of the syntaxes that is the same is commenting, right? So this is a single line comment, pretty simple. Obviously, when you save comments, they don't show up. They don't give you any output. It's purely just for you, right? It's for the developers so that you know what you've done and you can understand a complex thing that you've written, right? I personally don't comment a lot. I try to write code that describes itself. So I like to use symbol names for variables and functions and things like that that make sense out of the box. I don't like to use things that don't make sense. I don't do a lot of var A or var B or var C. I will do var name, right? And stuff like that because it makes more sense. I like the names to be able to describe what is happening, if I can. Same with parameters and arguments and things like that. Or not arguments, sorry, but parameters. I like to make sure their naming is properly. Fields, stuff like that. Just make it descriptive. Takes a few extra characters, and at the end of the day, when it gets uglified or compiled or whatever happens, it reduces itself down anyway, so it's not really a big deal. So this is a single line comment. Like I said, I don't use them very often. Multi-line comments are important, especially when you start dealing with more corporate systems. They like to have things very commented on what a function does, but there's a certain requirement to how they want it done. Most follow the, just total mind blank on what it's called. It's a particular format of commenting. It's the way it's done. It's usually you do a double asterisk, and if you're using VS Code, it will auto do this for you. You hit enter and it automatically creates this kind of block for you. This is called a multi-line comment. It starts with a slash and is preceded by one asterisk, though this automatically creates two, and it's closed by an asterisk and a forward slash. That allows you to be able to write many comments in a row, right, that are all stay commented out. This type of commenting tends to be able to describe certain aspects of it, right? So it should describe what inputs and outputs you require, what the functionality of the module is, and also any parameters that it may require. So we'll just write this one. We're going to say it returns a random integer between a minimum, let's spell minimum right today, and maximum number, including the minimum and maximum number. So this is going to be a random number generator that we're going to create. And then we detail what the parameters are that we require. And what's cool is VS Code will actually syntax highlight this so it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. So parameter number, the name of the parameter is called min, and the description for that is the starting number in the range. At param, again number, let's spell param right so this actually works. Number. So the thing in between the curly braces is your data type, which in JavaScript we technically have integers, doubles and stuff like that, but nobody uses that. They just use number. Number encompasses all of those data types. Again, loosey-goosey language. Max, the ending number in the range, and then we state what it returns. First we state its return data type, which is a number, and then we describe it. So it's a randomly determined integer. So it's kind of a hefty comment block, but it definitely describes what our function is actually going to do. And it seems, seems like a lost opportunity not to actually define the function. So why don't we define the function? The unction. Let's define the unction today. Today we're no longer using the letter F. We're just going to say unction. So our unction random int will return math.floor. Math is part of the core API built into JavaScript. Math.random times, and then in these wonderful brackets we're going to do max minus min plus 1 plus min. And that will return a random integer. I'll even be nice and copy and paste this for you folks. Now what's cool is when you define the function in here, it does become available over here. So within our console window, we can actually call random int. We need to provide it 2 numbers, and there we go. And every time we run it, we'll get a different random number. If you wanted to do 1 to many, you can as well. So this isn't so much about the function we just wrote, it's definitely about the commenting. Single line comments, multi-line comments, pretty simple stuff. Variables. Variables, I'm sure you guys, when you did your intro to JavaScript class, you wrote some variables, probably a number of variables. We're going to write variables too. However, we're not going to use one of the very common types of variables that you guys have used before. So this is an example of a hoisted variable, meaning that when the variable is defined, it's actually hoisted to the window object built into the browser's API. When we define var name equals whatever our name is, you don't have to type in my name, though most students tend to for some reason. What's happened actually is name now becomes part of the window object, a property of the window object, and the value Sean McKinnon automatically gets hoisted and added to that particular object. And I'll show you what I mean. If you're in this window and you want to clear the contents, you can either hit clear console or you can hit Control L, and that will clear out those contents. However, Control L doesn't work when WebEx is deployed, obviously. Instead, it wants to attempt to leave the meeting, so let's not do that. All right. So now if I go to window.name, it's currently blank because I didn't save it. Let's try it again, but we'll save it this time. There we go. Sean McKinnon. Because the value actually got hoisted. If you were to put this inside a function, again, the thing is just going to get hoisted. So if I do var age equals 42, and then I do window.age, oh, it didn't actually hoist it. Maybe it doesn't hoist it out of the functions. I thought it did. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it doesn't hoist it out of the functions. It does, however, hoist it out of conditional blocks, which it shouldn't do. Like so. Whereas when you have a block like this, it should be scoped, and any of the variable declarations inside the block should only be accessible within the block being denoted by your curly braces. But for whatever reason, JavaScript doesn't work that way. That's not how it's done. That's why when we got ES6, we got 2 brand new decorators. They're like scope modifiers. I don't think that's the proper term, though. I think it might be scope decorators, but maybe it is a modifier. Hoisting can be a problem because, for example, if I define a variable called var name within the global scope of my application, like so, and then I try to define a new name in here, but I assume that it's only scoped within my block, right? Like so. This should not contaminate the value on line 17, because technically it should only be scoped to the block itself. It isn't, though. That's the problem. This gets hoisted to the top of the file and replaces the current value of name. So when you go to check name, window.name, you can see it's Sarah, and Sean McKinnon has been entirely replaced. That's the problem with hosting. When you code within a block and you do variable declarations within the block, it should maintain the scope of your variable declaration to within the block. Meaning, even accessing Sarah outside of here, if I was to do a console log and console log name, it shouldn't say Sarah, it should say Sean, because it should only say Sarah within the block. That's the problem with hoisting. So what we do instead, now that ES6 came about, is we have 2 scope modifiers we can use other than var that eliminate hoisting altogether, because instead they add it to the global object, which you have no access to. And it doesn't automatically hoist, it respects block scope, which is cool. So those two are known as let and const. I'm not sure if you guys ever had experience with both of those, but they do fundamentally act different. Let is for mutable values, for declaring mutable variables, right? So anything you want that might change, this is for declaring those mutable values. Does that apply if you reference the name variable directly? I don't know if I can reference the name variable directly. Yes, it does. Yeah, it appears to. Actually, that makes sense because any property on the window object is automatically, when you go to type it in here, it just assumes it's part of the window object. So now in here, I can actually define a variable using let, right? And I'm not going to use name again because obviously we'll get a conflict, right? We'll get a collision. That's it. A variable collision name, a reference issue. So we'll call it something else. Let's call it hobby. And we'll just say Diablo because I like Diablo. There we go. And then we'll show the same thing again, if true. We don't even have to necessarily do if true. We can actually just define a block anywhere we want. But we'll do if true. Let hobby equal fighting cats. There we go. And then let's do console log here so you can see the value of hobby. And we'll do a console log here as well so we can see the value of the hobby in the block. So we defined it outside of the block in our global scope of our file, right? Then we've defined it here inside the block as well, right here, which now is scoped within the block. When it's scoped within the block, it means that the scope should pertain to only the block. So if this works, we should see we should see fighting cats here and Diablo here. So let's save it. There we go, fighting cats and Diablo, because the scope maintains within the block. Let is also tends to be better because it abides by the scope, and it tends to be what the industry wants you to use now. var is so not used as much, right? There's certain people that use it mostly because they have difficulty understanding hoisting and scoping, and so they use it because it's a quick way around problems. But learning how to properly use let and const makes life a little bit better. Const is our next one, but it's for declaring immutable variables. I mean, variable might be the wrong word there because it's not variably changing, but whatever. And the way that const works is it's a constant, right? That's what it stands for. It stands for constant, and we define it by typing in const, whatever the thing is that we want to type. So we'll give it a name of num, right? And we'll just make it equal to 5. And we'll save that. Incidentally, when you define variables in here, you can access them in the console window by just typing in the name. If I attempt to add a new value to num, I will get an error. Uncaught type error, assignment to constant variable. You're not allowed to reassign the variable. So I can comment that out. I just put my cursor next to it, hit Control /, and that auto comments out the value. The other thing to note about variables is you can define mutable variables ahead of time. So you can do let x, y, z, like so, and that's totally fine. They will just all be undefined. And then you can assign them a value later. However, you cannot do the same with constants. Constants have to be assigned their value at the moment of initialization. So you can do it with mutables, but you can't do it with immutables, which should seem obvious. You can also define variables, multiple variables at once, like we've done here, where you do x, y, z, and they will all abide by the same scope modifier. You can do the same thing with constants. You just have to make sure you give them values. And all those variables will be constants. Now, even though constants are technically immutable, they are only primitively technically immutable. So as long as you assign them a primitive, you can never change the primitive. So the primitives are numbers, strings, booleans, null, and undefined. Those are our primitives that we have available to us. We also have objects, or structured objects as they're called, which we can assign to constants. And even though we can't modify the initial structured object that has been assigned, we can modify its contents even though it's been assigned to a constant. So let me show you an example of that. Modifying a constant object's values. So let's just do const obj. Here's our object. This is known as an object literal when you just define it with the curly braces. We'll give it some properties. Let's do x equal to 1, y equal to 2, and z equal to 3. I mean, you have to love my examples. They're just so creative. Now the cool thing is even though this is a constant, I can go ahead and create a new property by just simply using the dot syntax, give it a label, let's do j, and give it a value. Notice there's no errors popping up, and if I was to access obj, I can see that it has the fourth property been added to it. However, what I cannot do is take obj and then assign it a new object. That's not okay. See, gets mad at me. I can't assign it a string. Doesn't like that either. It can only be the initial value structure assigned, which was an object. I am allowed to change its properties, but I am not allowed to change the initial assignment. This is definitely one that tends to catch people, so it's worthwhile explaining. So that's the one thing people do ask the question, if they're not mutable, like when you assign an object, if it's not immutable, why do we use it at all? The question is, we use constants because they give us a benefit, right? So they're immutably bound, meaning that whatever structured data value was assigned to it, whether it's an object or a primitive, it's immutably bound. However, the memory reference is bound to the constant, preventing reassignment. So you can't reassign the memory reference. But while you can modify the properties of the object inside the constant, you cannot assign a new value to the constant. So you do force the fact that once you've assigned it an object, it's stuck being an object. You don't have to worry about somebody modifying the value of the object itself. And then the second reason is readability. Constants make it clear what value type is dedicated to the constant. So when you use a constant and you assign it an object, you basically enforce type. So they cannot assign a new object to it. They can only assign the existing object that you've assigned. And it's important to note that constants, like variables, are block scoped. So if you define a constant within a set of curly braces like so, it is block scoped. Sorry, curly brace is the wrong term. Inside a block. This is known as a block, right? Block syntax structure. So if it's defined within the block, then it's block scoped. I don't want you to get confused because you might be like, well, this looks like a block, but it isn't. It's an object. They are slightly different. Well, actually, they're very different. Data types, super simple. We're going to glaze over data types. JavaScript supports strings, right, which is any type of string defined with any of the different string syntaxes that exist. You have 3 sets of string delimiters available to you. Double quotes, single quotes, and backticks. However, backticks actually denote a template string and can be a little bit more robust, and you can do some cool things with those. But just keep in mind that we have strings. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit when we look at concatenation. Numbers. Numbers actually defines any numerical value that you would assign in JavaScript. So that's integers, decimals, doubles, floats, whatever you want to call them. all of those, negatives, positive numbers, whatever, they are all considered number. They don't actually gain any different type of data type. They are just number. There's also Booleans, right? Just like in any language, true and false. There's null, which actually stands for nothing. Even though it's null and it's nothing, is not the same as undefined. Null means, hey, this variable exists and it technically has nothing assigned as a value. I know that's so weird, but that's how it works. Undefined, however, means it exists but has no value, meaning there's not even a memory allocation for it yet. It just exists. The variable is just floating around among the ether. There's also symbols, but we're not going to get into symbols. I think I've used symbols one time in my entire career. And there's big int, which is like for dealing with large numbers that are limited only by the available amount of memory that you have, which you would probably use in finance applications. So why don't we take a look at concatenation and string templates, because that kind of falls into the same kind of realm. So concatenation and string templates. You guys are probably used to concatenation. Some languages like PHP use the dot operator as a concatenating operator. Thank God JavaScript is pretty normal and it uses the plus operator as the concatenated operator. So why don't we define a constant? I mean, we learned about them, might as well use them. Constant, we'll just call it conc for short for concatenated, equals this is, to the plus sign, a concatenated, plus sign again, string. And we'll save it. Now when I go to output it, I see this is a concatenated string. So what happens is the string, this defines the string literal, then this adds it to the next string literal, and then this adds it to the next string literal, which combines it all into one string literal called this is a concatenated string. We can also use variables in here as well, right? So if I create a variable called num2 equals 10, I can also output a concatenated string. I'm just going to actually do it as a string literal in the console log. This is the number. Examples are hard. Num2. And as you can see, it says this is number 10. So we can also use variables in them as well. And that's important, actually. We need to be able to use variables. I mean, what else would you use a concatenated string for? Like, I don't think you'd ever do this. This is not a thing, right? But you do this kind of stuff a lot. Until you learn about string templates, and then you don't do it very much. So one thing also to note about concatenation, this plus operator, it does a lot of different things. It is not just the concatenated operator. It is obviously the additional operator used for adding numbers together, right? And that's important to understand because, for example, 5 plus 5, right, equals 10. We know that. Did you also know that console log 5 in string plus 5 is equal to 55? Well, that makes sense, right? Because we're concatenating a string with an integer, but this is where people get confused. 5 multiplied by 5 is 25. So the loose nature of how JavaScript interprets values is super important to understand because it is a loosey-goosey language, and this to it is an integer called 5 when you attempt to use it with the multiplying operator or the subtraction operator or the division operator or the modulus operator. It will actually treat it as a proper mathematical statement. However, when you use the plus operator, because the string actually overrides what this does, you wind up with a concatenated string. So just keep that in mind. That can be a gotcha. Especially when you're dealing with form inputs. Oh my god. That's where it really becomes a gotcha. All right, let's look at string interpolation. String interpolation is super awesome. Like I said, there are 3 different forms of string delimiters, right? We have double quotes, single quotes, and then we have the backtick. The backtick is super awesome. You can find the backtick on most US-style keyboards underneath the escape key. It shares the tilde. The tilde is a little curly thing. It shares that. So if I like console logs. I don't want to define a whole bunch of variables that I'm going to keep having to find names for. So I'm going to do a couple of backticks here, right? So that, again, is just below your escape key. And it works like a regular string. Hello, world. Right? Works just like a regular string. Hello, world. No big difference. But it has some power. One of the cool things about the template string is it has the ability to evaluate expressions within itself. Right? So if you've used PHP, PHP kind of has that capability. You're able to throw a value inside the PHP string if you're using double quotes, and it will evaluate the variable, right? But that's it. That's where it ends. It can evaluate variables, but it can't do much else. Whereas with JavaScript, you can actually evaluate full-out expressions right within the backticks. Let me show you what I mean. So here's our backticks. We will define a variable here. I think I already defined a variable called name up above. Yeah, there's name, right? I think right now it's currently valued at Sarah, but that's fine. Let's do hello. And then the way we execute an expression is we add this little piece of syntax, a $sign with 2 curly braces. This tells the JavaScript interpreter that this is an expression that we want to evaluate. So I'm going to put a name in here. So it says, hello, name. And then you could say, I don't know. Let's say 2 plus 2 equals, so we'll type it out properly, equals, and you can actually put in an expression in here as well. So it says, hello, Sarah, 2 plus 2 equals 4. I don't know why this is... Name is deprecated. Haha, you're funny. Doesn't like the variable name because it thinks it's a keyword. Backticks we're going to use quite a bit, especially when we get into React. We're going to wind up using backticks primarily. It's rarer, actually, that we use double quotes or single quotes when we start working with React. Any questions about commenting, variables, or concatenation or backticks? No? Cool. Let's talk about my favorite subject, debugging and troubleshooting. So one of the things that is a big issue in JavaScript, obviously, is being able to troubleshoot your code. And I feel like that's one of the things I found with like dealing with new developers, especially in like college courses. It seems to be the one thing that gets overlooked is just learning how to troubleshoot code. Like you need to troubleshoot code, right? So one way we do it is with the console. The console tells us a lot of information. Like for example, if I try to change the value of name, even though it's been assigned to a constant, I can't, right? Because it's going to actually cause an issue. For some reason, it didn't cause an issue. Oh, no, because it's not a constant. Sorry. I thought it was a constant. Let me try to reevaluate num2. Num2, you are now named Humphrey. So as you can see, the console is giving me information. It's telling me that I can't reassign a constant variable, that I'm not able to do that, right? So that's fine. You know, that's easy to figure out. It's pretty self-explanatory. It tells you right off the bat what is wrong. But what if we need to test code, right? We want to be able to test code and be able to say, hey, this code has a problem. So we can do that as well. We can write if conditions, for example, but the easiest way to do that would be able to throw an error. So we can do that. We can write an if condition. We'll say if num2 is less than 20, we'll throw an error because it's not allowed to be. So we'll throw a new error. num2 is less than 20, with lots of exclamation marks to show that we are upset. And there we go. Now we have this custom error within our console telling us there is a problem. The only thing is, though, is this error would actually cause our application to stop. There we go. We have a little console log that's confused. Doesn't know where it is. But we never get to it, so we never get to find out that it's lost because we have this particular syntax throwing an error. So how can we handle that? Well, we can do it in a few ways. We can actually catch it by using a try and catch syntax. What the try will do is it will try to execute this code. I'm just going to highlight it, hit Control-X, come into the try and paste it into place. It's going to try this code, and if it hits an error, then the catch will actually catch the error. So I'm going to write error here. And instead of actually throwing the error and blocking the rest of the code execution, I'm going to write a console error message out and pass it error. So now you can see that we're getting our error message. It's still nice and red, still shows up, but it didn't block the execution of our code because the catch doesn't actually allow the throw to do what it would normally do, which is throw an error and halt our code operation. So try catches are super handy. They allow us to be able to see what is going on with our code. Now the thing is what if you were to accidentally make a mistake and instead of checking to see if it was less than 20, you accidentally checked to see if num2 was greater than 20? Right? Which it isn't, which means this code never executes, and you might be like, well, I don't know what's going on. So you might need some way to be able to look at your code more intrinsically. The easiest way to do that would be able to figure out what the value of num2 was when the code was executing. Now, in most languages, we have breakpoints, right? We could just add a breakpoint. The code will stop at that point. We can evaluate whatever variables are defined at that point and then figure out what's wrong with our code. In JavaScript, we use a keyword called Debugger, which essentially acts like a breakpoint. What the debugger will do is it will trigger whatever debugging mechanism is built into the client that you're accessing your JavaScript with. So if I hit Control-S, as you can see, everything has stopped. And we've got this kind of weird window showing up. You can see that the debugger line has been highlighted. We can see paused in debugger with a little triangle and a little round thing here. But what do? Right? We're under this weird tab called Sources. Where do we go? Well, what we can do is actually jump back into our console here, and now we have access to anything that may have been defined within this scope even, right? So I'm going to type in num2, and I can see, oh, well, num2 is actually valued at 10. And obviously num2 is not going to be greater than 10. So now I can be able to troubleshoot and see what my value is, and then be able to affect the outcome for what I'm trying to achieve. So I'm going to click the continue button, and what it will do is cause the script to continue to the next debugger line it encounters, or just continue on till the script is exited. So now I can go ahead and fix my code and hit save, and again it's going to hit the debugger line again. So if I want to stop the debugger, I can either just comment it out or remove it, and then I still have to hit this button to continue through so that it's all fixed. I wonder why that's giving an error. That's weird. Oh, error is undefined. Yeah, because it's never actually encountered yet. If you lose your console, you can click these little arrows and just go to console through there as well. When you get an error, there is a bit of an anatomy to the error message. You'll get the error message that shows up here. You can kind of see some information on what the executing client was and where it actually executed from. It will generally tell you the file of where the executed error happens in, right? So it's actually happening in round1.js, and you can usually see what line it's happening on, which it's saying it's happening on line 59. Now, the one thing to note, though, even though it states the error happened on line 59, that's not true. Because if you look, line 59 is our console error. This is where we're actually outputting the error message, so that's where it's stating. But if you open up this thing, it tells you right here that it's actually happening and triggered at line 56. So you have to kind of read your error messages to get an idea of where it's happening. And if you look at line 56, sure enough, we're throwing the new error, right? One thing I've always noted that a lot of newer programmers, when they get into this type of stuff, especially when you start dealing with React, you get these monolithic error messages that are like, 50 lines. And it's very difficult to tell where your error is. What you want to do is train yourself to look for your files, right? So look through that list for the files that you recognize that are your files. And once you find that file that's yours, likely whatever error message or whatever code was executed at that point is the problem code. So then you can go and kind of go through your code and find that problem and then fix it. And usually it will be obvious. One last thing I want to show you is the network tab. Not a super big deal until we start working with APIs, but definitely something to note. If you click on these double arrows and click on the network tab, you'll notice that our files are listed in here. We can see the index.html, we can see the round one, and we can see this WS, which is a WebSocket file. It's how live server is working. If you click on the round one file, you can actually see a preview of the file and it will show you what was loaded. If you click on the headers, it will actually show you how the request was transformed and sent. This information, while not very knowledgeable right now, maybe some of you do know quite a bit about requests and responses. For those of you that don't, it's not super important to understand. But when we start working with, even with React, whenever you attach a file and it doesn't attach properly, it might throw an error inside your network, and you can actually look at the network and see that the file is not attached. We can kind of force this. If I go to index.html and change this from round 1 to round 2 and hit save, you can see I've got this pinkish color here and it says it's a 404. 404 stands for not found. If I click on the file, we can see the status code was not found. I've got no preview, there's no response. The reason is that something is wrong with the file that I'm requesting. There's actually nothing wrong with the file, it's just the file itself does not exist. So I can go to my code, I can tell that that's the problem, and I can save it, and sure enough, it fixes the problem. So familiarizing yourself with the developer tools is definitely crucial. Even when working with React, React will spit out a lot of information in our terminals, which we'll discuss next week. But there's a lot of information that also goes out to the console that's worth your while to know. So it is definitely worth your time to become familiar with the network tab, with the console tab, and using the debugger, as well as using try-catch. Try-catch is definitely important. We'll be using quite a bit of try-catch in our code. Any questions about troubleshooting? No? All right, we have like 9 minutes and then our next break. Let's take a look at scope, arrays, and objects. So scope, super simple. Scope is the visibility of your code, right? What is the visibility of my code within the current scope that I'm in? Right now, we are at the global scope of this file, and our code is globally scoped to the file that we're in. So when I define a variable, it's actually scoped within this file right now. Why is that saying... Oh, because I wrote var. Well, why don't we change that to constant? There we go. We'll call it constant, because that's not confusing. And then when I type in constant, I can see true. This is scoped within the global aspect of my file. However, it is also available to anything scoped downwards as a child, right? So an if condition, for example, which has its own scope within its blocks, still has access to this file, or access to this variable declaration. See? It says true. However, if I define a variable inside here, right? The scope maintains within the blocks and is not accessible outside of the blocks. So this should say it is undefined. No, it will actually say it's not defined because this has never been declared. Block scoping, most things you guys should be already used to with block scoping. It's pretty much anything that has curly braces except for object literals. So that includes functions, obviously, but I mean functions are block scope regardless. While loops, for loops, right? Those are all block scope. Switch statements, even though they don't have curly braces, they are technically also block scoped as well. So just keep that in mind that those things are block scoped. Classes, for obvious reasons as well. They are all block scoped. So just keep that in mind. That's how scoping works within JavaScript. All right, cool. Let's look at arrays. So JavaScript doesn't have arrays as like a data type. They're not in a native data type. They're technically part of the object structures that are available. Because like most things in JavaScript, most things except for the primitive data types are objects. So, you know, the DOM that you might work with, functions are technically objects, arrays are objects, object literals are objects. They're all come from this object structured data piece that's built into JavaScript. So because of that, arrays do have constructors, though, that make them a little simpler to work with, and one of them is the square bracket constructor. There's a few different ways to declare an array. You can declare an array by using this kind of syntax, new array, like so. That will create an array. And this makes sense because, like I said, they are objects, so you're essentially instantiating the new object, right? The other way to declare them is by just using the shorthand syntax with the square brackets. That also creates an array. These two things are exactly the same thing. However, this is shorthand that basically automatically instantiates the constructor for us. To add values to an array, you can initialize the array with values right off the bat. But if you want to add new values to the array, that's easy as well. You can use the push command, which is a method on the array object, and then you just give it a list of things that you want to add. So as you can see, I have all 6 values in my array. I can remove items quite easily from an array by just popping them. That will remove them from the end. As you can see, we've lost F. If I want to remove them from the beginning, I can shift them. As you can see, we've lost A. If I want to add things to the beginning, I can unshift. And that will add it to the beginning. If I want to remove specific items, like say I want to remove the letter C, I can use either slice or splice. Each one does it differently. Splice is destructive, meaning that it will remove the letter and that's it, the whole thing is done. Slice will just remove the letter and return it, but won't actually destruct the array, the original array. So if we use splice, we want to go to index 1 and remove 1. And that should remove C. Oh no, sorry, it removes B. Obviously it removes B. So it went to index 1, which is right before B, and then removed the value at index 1. You can actually capture that value as well. As you can see, it returns back an array with just the value that you have. You can also increase this number and remove a few values and capture all of those values. And then if you check R, you can see that it has removed them permanently from that. Like I said, you can use splice or slice. Slice is not destructive though. So this original array would stay the same way. So if I remove the P here, and we look at splice val, you can see I've got B and C, but if I look at the original array, it's unaffected. There's a lot of array methods that are available. There's also length. Length is pretty handy as well for telling how many elements are in the array. So there's 2 elements in the array because we spliced it. In addition to those type of methods like splice, length, shift, pop, all of those, there's quite a few others, including some higher order functions that are available, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in case you're wondering why I'm not covering map and all that. Like I said though, arrays are technically just objects. If I output it, here's our array. It looks like an array. But as you can see, it has these indices, but it also has a proto and a length method, like a property, sorry, called to. Under the proto, there's a whole bunch of different things, including its constructor. Its constructor comes from the array object, which has a proto as well. And its proto should be, right, it's function. Function has a proto, and that's object. Unless I'm going down the rabbit hole here. I'm going down the rabbit hole. It does go to an object at the end. They all inherit from object. So 0 and 1 are technically properties. That's why you have to be careful with using things like delete. So if I delete R0, for example, and then output R, you can see we have an empty, but you can see now I only have one property. I don't have the 0 property anymore. And if I try to R0, I get undefined because it doesn't exist. And that's because it's an object, unlike most arrays in other languages, which would just remap themselves. So just keep that in mind, that an array is technically an object, and it can lead to a few anomalies. Objects are super simple. We just denote them with curly braces. We can give them initial values as well. I like to split them apart when I go to add values to it. You can give strings, numerical values. You can give arrays as values as well. You can also give other objects if you wanted to. Like so. If you want to see what's in an array, in an object, you can simply console log out the object itself, and you get to see the values inside your console of what's inside that object. We'll be using objects and arrays a lot. Like a lot. So much, a lot. Any questions about objects or arrays? No? Is all this pretty familiar? Like, just recapping? Yeah? That's what I thought. Cool. So, a question before we take our break. Can I skip conditional statements then? Like if conditions? You guys know about if-else, right? You know how to write an if-else statement? Cool. What about a for loop and a while loop? Do you know how to write those in JavaScript? They're the same as Java. Cool. So what we're going to do next after the break here is we'll take a look at higher order functions. Then we'll look at the for let loop and the for of loop. Or sorry, for in loop and for of loop. Who was your JavaScript professor? Maybe I know them. Oh, is it Jessica? Yeah, I know Jessica. Yeah, we're actually team sharing PHP classes this semester. Because she's on maternity leave in 6 weeks, and then I'll be taking over her class after that. But I went to school with Jessica too. We actually went to Georgian together and took the same course. I will for sure. So yeah, we'll do those, and then we'll do destructuring and spread, which you'll likely have not done. And arrow functions. Arrow functions are so awesome. All right, so let's take 10 minutes. I'll see you guys at 5:10. 5:12, actually. Okay. Quick question before we get too far. Have you guys had any experience with using shells like PowerShell or Git Bash or Terminal or anything like that? No? I wasn't sure. Like, I always thought they were going to teach, like at the Georgian course we've pushed for years in the computer analyst programming, or the programming analyst course, for them to learn Linux, because it's kind of an essential thing to learn, but I guess a lot of them never learn it. Okay, so we'll take it slow then, because we will be doing Terminal in this class quite a bit, so you guys will get quite a bit of experience with it. Maybe we'll use PowerShell to start, but we should look at Git Bash at some point, because it's definitely more tolerable than PowerShell. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about iteratives. Not much though, just the array and object versions of them, as well as destructuring and spread and higher order functions. So why don't we start with iteratives? I've got this in the wrong order. We should put iteratives first. Let's create a new... we'll use the same file. I mean, why not? Let's just clear it. Iterating over an array. Yeah, we'll do iterating over an array. Let's create a new array. Const R2 could just use the existing array we already have, but that's fine. So what I want to do is I want to iterate over this array and capitalize each of the letters. Pretty simple task. So I can use a regular for loop if I wanted to. Like I could do for, and then create the initialized variable. So let I equal 0. If I is less than, and then I can just use a count on the array. So we'll just check its length, right? Then I plus plus. And then what I can do is just console log out to the browser. R to I, right, which should find that index number and load it up to the length of the array, and then we'll just use the to uppercase function call. And there we go, we get A, B, C, D. So those letters, all uppercase. I mean, that's okay. I don't like the readability of for loops. I find it's kind of clunky. So what we can do instead is actually use the for of loop, which was invented for ES6 and specifically made to handle arrays. And what it looks like, and it's a little cleaner, is for let item of, and this can be whatever name you want. It doesn't have to be item. It could be I. It could be whatever you want it to be. It's just a throwaway variable. Every time the iteration happens, this is going to get replaced with a value from the array. So of R2, and then we'll just do console.log R2 I got to uppercase. Oops, not I. Why did I say I? We don't say that at all. We say item. That's what we say. It's been a long day. And it gives us the same result, but arguably it's a lot more readable, right? I know that item is part of the array, and I know that what I'm affecting is item, as opposed to some random index number on the array. So this is a little bit more readable to me. We can do the same thing with an object, right? So if I create an object, I think we're on obj3. I can iterate and actually view the keys. So I can say for let key of obj3, and if I console log, I can view the key. But what you'll notice, did I not call it through obj3? Oh, sorry, not of, it's in. My apologies, in. What you'll notice is I get X, Y, Z. I don't get the values, I only get the keys. If I want the values, what I would have to do is type in obj3 here and reference the key like an index. And then I would get the values for it. But that's kind of goofy. So what I like to do instead is use a combination of the of loop, the for of loop. So I'm going to say key and value, like so, of object.entries. Nope, stop that. Don't fill in things I didn't ask you to fill in. obj3. And then I'm going to console.log key and value. And now I can see those. And you might be like, okay, well, why does that work? How does that work? Well, object entries, what it does is it takes all of the keys of the object and turns them into index 0 array, and then it takes the values and turns those into index 1. If we want to understand better on how something works, sometimes console log really does become our best friend. So if I do console log object.entries obj3, like so, we can kind of see what object.entries is going to return. So as you can see, it returns 3 arrays. And in those arrays, we get the property name of the array and then the value. Again, property, value, property, value. So we get an array of arrays. So that's cool. So what is this wonderful piece of magic doing? This little bit right here. Well, this is known as destructuring. Inside JavaScript, as of ES7, we have the ability to do something called destructuring, where we can actually take values from an array and destructure them into variable properties. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're taking the values from the array and destructuring them into the variable properties. So this is an example of destructuring. So let's simplify that so you can actually see what it looks like normally. Here's my array. Very basic array. And what I want to do is take 1, 2, and 3 and assign them to variables, A, B, and C. So what I can do is I can type in const. I give it an array of symbol names, so A, B, and C. And then I make it equal to an array of values. Like so. Now if I console log those out, A, B, and C, we should get 1, 2, and 3. We can do the same thing with an object, but the difference is when I'm destructuring an array, I can make these whatever name I want them to be. It doesn't matter. If I want to call this Bob, Kevin, and Daryl, that's totally okay. It doesn't matter. But when I destructure an object, the variable names must be the same names as the properties, or I have to alias them. So let's keep it simple, and we'll just take a look at what I mean first. So we'll create an obj4, and I'm going to create name for me, age 42, and we'll just leave it nice and small for now. And what I want to do is destructure those into name and age. So you can't use square brackets, unfortunately, because we're not destructuring an array, we're destructuring an object. So whatever symbol you use here must reflect whatever the symbol the value uses. So if you're destructuring an object, you have to use an object of variable symbol names. If you're destructuring an array, you use an array of variable symbol names. So in here, I just type in name and age, like so, because it has to be the same as the name of the properties in here. and then destructure obj4. Oh, right. Name has already been defined further up, so that's not a good thing. So why don't we just call this my name and my age, so we don't wind up with symbol collisions. And then I'll show you how to fix that the good way, the better way. So now if we console log that out, console.log, my name, my age, we can see Sean and 42. So it's kind of an easy way to be able to take properties from an object and destructure them into variable names, which is kind of neat. But like I said, these are one-to-one, right? So because this property is called my name, the variable must be called my name. If I don't want it to be called my name, and I want to give it a different value, or a different property name, then I have to change that. So the easiest way to do that, so you can see I've already defined these two. What if I want to create new variable names, right? I can't just go my name, my age equals obj4, because I'm going to wind up with a symbol collision, right? I've already declared my name. I can't redeclare it. So what I want to do instead is rename it. So I type in the colon, just like I'm creating a new property, and we'll call it the name. There we go. Now if I save, I'm now getting the same error for my age, but the name is no longer throwing an error. So we'll create an alias for it as well. And we're good. If I type in the name here, as you can see, it works. One other issue that may occur is you might go to actually destructure the values from an object, but the object might be missing values that you thought should exist. Right? So I'm going to create another object, const obj5. Equals, let's do A as 7, B as 8. And then I want to destructure that into some variables, right? A, B, but I'm going to get a conflict, right? Because we already have it defined. So we'll just do A as A and B as B. There we go. But it wants the value because it is a constant. So we'll need to make it equal to obj5. So there we go. But now if I was to try to destructure C as well, it looks like it's already been defined. So we'll do that. Try to destructure C and then access it. You notice I'm going to get an undefined, right? Because it has no value yet. We've never actually defined it in the object, but we might not know that. We might have, and this can happen in Mongo, you might have documents in Mongo that contain data in one document but aren't necessarily in another document. So if we want to be able to have a default value so that when we access C that it does equal something, we can actually define a default value in here as well. We just simply add an equals and then give it the value. So now when I go to access C, we can see that it is equal to 5 because it now has a default value, even though the value wasn't defined here. However, if I modify my object and give it a value and then access C, we can say that it is equal to the original object's value. So basically this will override, sorry, this doesn't override the value. This will replace an undefined value, but not override a value that has been predefined. Destructuring is confusing. So confusing. But you guys are going to get used to it because we're going to do it a lot. Like, so much. All the time. Every day. Speaking of confusing, spread. Spread is really cool. Spread is an operator, much like the plus sign or the negative sign or anything like that, that allows us to be able to take a list of values and automatically dump them out as a list of arguments. Right? So for example, say I have an array We'll just call it person. And it's got Sean in it, and the age, or 42 in it. Let's make it an actual value. And true, whatever true happens to be related to. And we have a function called greeting. This is how we define a function in JavaScript. And the function takes 3 values, right? It takes the name, the age, and we'll just say status, right? Status. And then it's just going to simply console log out name, age, and status. All it's going to do. When I call greeting, I can fill in these values manually, but if I already have an array with the values in place, what I can do instead is I can just spread the array values. So I type in ... that's my spread. Type in person, and hit the colon. So now you can see Sean, 42, and true. What's happening is it takes this list and it basically pulls it out of the array and spreads it as a list of arguments that I can then use in something like greeting. What's cool about this is I can create clones with it as well. So if I wanted to create a clone of that person, I can do the same thing. I can define an array, but then I can do ... person. And now when I access the clone, which I can't hit Control L because I'll end the meeting. When I type in clone, as you can see, I have these values. Yes, the Clone Wars. Spread operators can also be used for objects as well. They get used quite often, and the biggest reason is because when we start working with React and we work with state, we have to be able to do spread because you can't change the value of the state variable. You have to replace it entirely. You can't just modify it. You can't access the state variable and just replace the value. You have to actually modify the state value entirely. So spread becomes super important when we're trying to store objects. So we're going to be using spread quite a bit. It's kind of neat. There's more information in the lesson plan that I posted online, so I definitely would recommend looking at that because it's pretty cool. All right, I saved the best 2 for last. The best 2 are arrow functions and higher order functions. So we've been doing iteration using the for let and the for in. Sorry, the for of and the for in, which are pretty easy to use. But obviously iteratives are, such a robust part of JavaScript, and anytime you're working with arrays, you're going to be constantly doing iteratives. They actually have better iterative methods for arrays specifically. So let's take a look at iterative. Let's try it with letters that actually exist in the world. Iterative array methods. There we go. And we have so many arrays right now. I mean, we could just use one. I want to clear this console, so what we can do is we can actually do console.clear. So we don't have to worry about it showing up with the stuff before. We'll create a new one. We'll just call it my array. And we'll add Sean to it. 42. True. Whatever we want in there. Actually, let's just add a list of names. That makes more sense. Let's add a list of names. So let's do Nicholas. Let's do Gillian. Let's do Sky. And let's do Stella. There we go. We have an array of names. What I want to do is iterate over this array, and I want to capitalize each of the names. So what I'm going to use is called a higher order function. And what a higher order function is, it's a function that takes a function as an argument. Your mind blowing yet? So I'm going to call the method, and that method actually takes a function as an argument. And what it does is it executes the function on each of the items passed within the array. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So first of all, say I just want to console log them all. I don't want to actually modify their values, right? We just want to console log what they are. So if I do my array dot for each, so that's going to iterate over each item within the array. Now I can define the function. So I'm going to use something called an anonymous function here. So we'll pass it name as the argument. There we go. So what will happen is on each iteration, it's going to take a value and plug it into our function as this argument. It doesn't matter what we call this argument. We can call it whatever we want, but we need to give some sort of argument for each to be able to pass the value into. Now we can just go console.log name.toUppercase. And there we go. Sean, Nicholas, Jillian, Sky, and Stella all capitalized. Now this hasn't modified anything, right? Like my array still is the same. Nothing's changed. Doesn't look any different, right? They're still the same values. All we've done is simply output them. But what if I wanted to be destructive and actually modify those values entirely? Well, there are ways to do that. One way I can do that, if I still don't want to destruct this name, but create a new list of new names, what I can do is go const by capital names equals my array. And what I'm going to use is map. What map will do is iterate over the list, and as it iterates over each item, it will run the function against the item and then return it for us. So I'm going to do that. So we'll do function name, and then I'm going to return name.toUppercase, like so. And then I'm going to just check the value of my capital names. And as you can see, I now have a list of those capital names, but I still haven't modified this list in any way. So these are kind of nice higher order functions. You're going to use these quite a bit. There's a lot of other ones as well. Like for example, filter. Filter's a really cool one. Like for example, we could do const no s's equals my array dot filter, and then we need the function, the name, and then we just give it a condition, right? So we just do a test against it. So we will return, and you probably have never seen this before, it's a bit odd. We're going to look for any instance of s at the beginning of the word. So there we go. So it's a little bit of regex. And we're going to test against name. So no s's. Oh, sorry, it's only returning those. So what we want to do is make this opposite. So we'll wrap it in a set of parentheses. And we'll add the not operator in front of it. So that way it's not with s's. And there we go. We only have Nicholas and Jillian. We filter out anything that has met this requirement. Sorry, we didn't filter out. We filtered in anything that has met the requirement. Now, so far we've been using a standard function called, this is known as an anonymous function. Anonymous function is a function with no name, hence the term anonymous function. And you can write anonymous functions quite a bit, right? My func equals function name console.log do thing, right? And this is a function, and you call it the same way you would call any function. My funky func, like so. Pretty easy, right? As opposed to a named function, and the name function the only difference between the two is it has a name. But then we also have something called an arrow function. Arrow functions are really cool because what they have two not properties. They have two what's the word I'm looking for? It's not properties. They have two things that they're used for, right? One, they can be used because they're short form. They're super short, they're easy to write, and if you're only writing anonymous functions and you don't necessarily need a name function, they're very quick for that kind of operation. They're especially handy when you're writing higher order functions where you're passing an anonymous function in as an argument. When you're doing that, arrow functions just make more sense for that kind of operation. However, the other thing they have is how they treat the context of this, the keyword this, right? This pertains to the function instance it's contained in. So right now, if I was to access this inside this window at a global state, it would be referencing the window object because that's the closest object that it relates to. However, if I access this within a higher order function, this is going to relate to the filter function. It moves up. But if I don't want it to do that, if I want it to still access the window function, what I can do is use an arrow function. And then it doesn't lose its context at all. It actually maintains the context of the window. It maintains the context of the major function it's been called within. Very confusing, not super important. The thing that's nice about them is how elegantly small they are and yet perfectly legible they are. So let's take a look at an example of an arrow function. So an arrow function has some of the basic syntax structures that a name function does. It just doesn't have a name. It also has some of the basic structures as a function. So first, you need a place to put your parameters, right? So our parameters go within these little blocks here. So I'm going to have param1 and param2, right? So they go within the parentheses. Now, in order to denote that this is a function, I use this arrow, right? Some people call it the rocket. I just call it the arrow, or a fat arrow. Some people call it a fat arrow. And then you give it a block. Making an adding thing. So that's nice. Doesn't seem to take up less room than, say, the myfunkyfunk or anything. It seems to be about the same. However, if we're only returning one line as we are here, we can actually write this function a little smaller. So why don't we revise it? Arrowfunc2 equals param1, param2, and then we can return. We don't even have to actually add the return statement because it's implicit. So if there's no return statement, no block, there's no block, it's implicit that this is automatically whatever the value this results in is returned. So we've taken our arrow function of 3 lines and turned it into a 1-line arrow function. If our arrow function only has one parameter, we can actually get away without using the parentheses at all. Super small. All we're doing is passing the parameter in and then adding 10 to that parameter. So we can get away with not using an arrow function in any, or sorry, not using a parentheses list whatsoever. Incidentally, for anything with a single expression that is in a block, you can actually get away with not including the curly braces at all. So if I say, for example, if true, and I want to say console log something, I can just say if true console log, and that is totally valid syntax. No parentheses required. I can even add an else statement to it. Which is never going to execute because this is if true, right? So why don't we do if num2 is greater than 3? Isn't this cool? I don't even know what the value of num2 is. Not really. You can do it with for loops as well, which a lot of people don't know, but you can. So if you did for let item of r console.log item, it will output whatever those values are. You don't need to use the curly braces because you're using a single expression line. And if you don't like how it's all on one line together, you can move it to the next line. But just keep in mind that if you were to try to add another line, it won't take advantage of it as being a part of the loop. So instead of this executing twice, it only ever executes once. The last thing that I want you to be aware of before we go tonight is something called a ternary statement. And maybe some of you have already used ternaries often, but ternaries are super important, especially when we start working with React, because you can't write if conditions in JSX. It doesn't work. It's not something you're capable of doing. So what you do instead is you write ternary statements, and ternary statements work like an if-else condition, basically. Essentially what a ternary statement does is it evaluates a condition and then defines whether or not it is true or false. If it is true, it will execute the code on the immediate right of it. If it's false, then it executes the code on the right of that. So what it looks like is this. Let's do val equals our condition, which you can wrap in parentheses. You don't have to. I like to because it then kind of shows, what's happening. So if num2 is greater than 10, then we're going to execute this particular thing on this side, right? Let's do console.log. Yep. Other words, that's what this little icon means. Console.log. No. Now the reason why it's kind of freaking out is because we forgot the operator of the question mark. The question mark basically says, it asks this question. Is this num2 greater than 10? It's essentially asking that as a question. If it is, then it executes the first statement it encounters as the true statement. Otherwise, it executes this statement as the true statement. If I save that, you can see, nope, num2 is not greater than 10. This ternary statement is going to come in super handy when we start working with React. Is there anything else I want to go over? I think that's a lot. I think that is definitely a lot. All right, I'm going to create a GitHub repository for tonight, which it looks like I've never signed into. And I'm going to call it Conc 2068 lesson 01 example. And then I will put it up for you guys. Oh, lovely. I don't even have half the things installed that I need tonight. I don't really like using PowerShell if I can avoid it. Actually, I'm curious if I even have Git on here. I might not. Let's try Git. No, I don't have Git. All right, so I will install Git and then I will push that up because I don't have Git installed yet. I thought I did, but I don't. I'll push it up, and then I'll add it to the D2L so that it's available. Now that I know what that means. Desire to learn, right? Any questions about any of the stuff that we went over tonight? If you have any questions, what's the best way to contact me? Yes, thank you. So if you have any questions, make sure you send me a Slack message. Otherwise, you can email me, but it might take a little longer for me to respond. I will post this code in like the next few minutes. I just have to install Git, and I don't want to make you guys wait for that. Other than that, don't forget the quiz, and have a great night. My pleasure. Cheers. You're welcome. Bye. See you next week.